activism and the media in clean energy. For 14 years, Rona Fraud has worked hard to tell an important story. There are numerous, potentially profitable businesses and investment opportunities built around sustainable living practices. Her website, sustainablebusiness.com, boasts over 100,000 unique visitors per month, each coming to learn more about this exciting subject. When I visited Rona near her home in Huntington, New York earlier in 2010, we developed an instant friendship that has blossomed into a partnership between sustainable business and 2 Green Energy. Craig Shields, why don't we just start with your website Sustainable Business, one of the most well-developed and well-respected in the world. What makes it unique? Rona Fraud, the fact that we started it in 1996. It was one of the first websites to focus on sustainable business in the world. We did start it at the dawn of the Internet. At that time, the state of the industry was completely different than it is now. It was still a fairly small, fragmented community of people spread around the world that were interested in this. What was most useful about using the Internet at that time was its ability to find people all over the planet who were not connecting with each other and bringing them together. That was why I started sustainablebusiness.com, to do all the things that I am doing now. Then, just as now, we were providing information, whether it was news about the advancement of sustainable business or jobs or letting people meet one another through business connections and all those various things. No one was doing any of that at the time. So in order to find a job, for example, there were printed newsletters that you could subscribe to that came out once a quarter. They would have some pretty general jobs that ran from biologist to scientist to engineer to various kinds of what I would call old-line environmental jobs. Of course, a lot of them would be already filled by the time you received the newsletter, so it was just a completely different way of providing that kind of information. There was nobody at all providing news on a daily basis. Our focus at that time was all on positive news. So the idea was to let people know about the positive things that were happening, what companies were doing to advance sustainability within business. That emphasis shifted over the years as there became much more news, and at some point it just didn't become realistic anymore to just provide positive news. It would look silly at this point to have a news feed that focused just on what companies are doing in a positive way, because there are now thousands of companies that are doing things, where at that time there were dozens. The whole field has morphed completely. There just wasn't all that much news back then. We basically covered everything that was going on. Now of course you could never do that. So a lot of it has to do with how the field has just multiplied tremendously in leaps and bounds in the last 14 years. I could not call it greenbusiness.com because using the word green was considered hokey. So, all of these things have changed over the years. So that is what made us unique, that is, that we were the first to pull all of that together and provide news and jobs and ways for people to connect with each other on an ongoing basis. CS, right. Well, speaking of green, where do you see this going from the standpoint of the perception of the word green? I have interviewed certain people who have suggested that we have hit a wall, that people are saturated with this idea. Do you consider that this is going to be a movement that represents a huge paradigm shift where in a few years everybody will have some level of eco-sensitivity, or do you think it has hit something of a wall? RF, I think that is really hard to know. I do not really focus on one word versus another word. Having said that, there was a period of time probably about 5 years ago where people tried not to use the word green, because it turned off so many people, and so they focused on high-performance buildings or advanced buildings. Now I see, People feel completely comfortable using the word green, and they use it all over the place. So, I think green has gained an acceptance. I think that a lot of the negative connotation associated with it has gone away. There will always be naysayers. There are global warming deniers too. Yes, that is for sure. I find it intensely difficult to try to keep up with what is happening in all these areas at any depth. You have a staff, but I presume there are challenges associated with keeping your finger on the pulse of what is happening around the world on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. Can you speak to that? RF, it has become an extremely noisy universe. It has really gotten to the point where you can look at it like any other field, as if you were an expert in technology or healthcare or any other sector of our economy. Are you going to be able to keep up with every single thing that goes on every day? Absolutely not. Our field has become like that, and that's a good thing. What is hard for an internet business is that it has become incredibly noisy in terms of the number of websites, the number of blogs, the number of competing, and redundant, information services. Yes, exactly. There are sites that are simple news feeds that just do not even aspire to original content. And that must make that a little bit difficult. RF, it has all become very difficult, especially in trying to make a living doing it. We compete with countless free services doing similar things. They may not be doing it at the level of quality that we are doing it at. In fact, I can tell you for sure that they are not. But that does not matter to a lot of people. It is harder to be found and it is harder to stand out. Whereas a few years ago it was still easy. I am happy to say we are still at the top of the pack here, but now the difficulty is trying to get through all the obfuscation as opposed to standing out for what we do. Yes, what do you see as the frontier in terms of sustainable living and eco-stewardship? What are the most important principles that people overlook? RF, I think an area that is really hard to get on the big radar screen the way renewable energy has is sustainable agriculture. It is a huge industry, and it is enormously destructive for the environment. Yes, are you talking about slash and burn agriculture in the rainforests, or are you talking about Monsanto and things like that? RF, I'm talking about Monsanto and Cargill and ADM and big agriculture that produces our food. Yes, could you take a couple minutes and talk about the most egregious, unsustainable practices that are common in agribusiness? RF, well, it has been shown now that agriculture contributes somewhere around 30% of global warming emissions. By producing our food organically rather than using chemically intensive agriculture, we could make big dents in climate change. And so it is very important that agriculture goes through this transition. Just like the fossil fuel energy has to go through the transition to clean energy, agriculture has to go through the same transition from chemical-based agriculture based on monocultures, massive single-crop farming, to organic agriculture based on improving the soil and based on using many crops and rotating them. Of course, the use of genetically modified crops is a very difficult barrier to achieving organic agriculture. The main idea that Monsanto and others have tried to put forward in their propaganda is based on lies. But they are so powerful and so diligent in putting forth their agenda that people believe them. Monsanto has said all along that one of the main benefits of using GMO, genetically modified organism, crops is that you do not have to till the soil, which is a lot of what destroys the soil, and destroys the microorganisms in the soil. They said that it would reduce pesticide use, because they inject these GMOs into crops and supposedly that means you don't have to use as many pesticides. But the opposite has proved true. Farmers that use GMO crops are actually using more pesticides. Obviously, there is a lot of controversy over the health effects of taking genetic material from a completely different organism and putting it into another plant, and we really don't know what the health effects are of that. Those GMOs can drift onto organic farms and spoil those crops. So it is all very important and just as difficult an area to tackle. CS. What do you think should be the role of government in moving what is essentially the private sector, agribusiness, big energy, etc. into more sustainable practices? RF. The role of government has always been to provide funds for the basic research that is necessary to commercialize new industries. That is what the government did for the Internet, which is why we have the Internet, because in many situations the private sector is not going to pay for the basic research needed to develop an industry. So the only one to pay for that is the government. And it plays a crucial role there. CS. What about incentive in creating a level playing field? RF. What we are trying very hard to get the government to do right now, unsuccessfully, is to put a price on carbon. And that will unleash the innovation that we are all looking for to get us off and running to a green economy. As long as we are not including the so-called externalities, all of the costs involved in producing fossil fuels, or fossil fuel-based agriculture, whatever the industry, we are not including all the costs involved. In these cases, those fossil fuel-based industries are always going to be cheaper and the green economy cannot emerge until we have this level playing field. CS. That is exactly what I believe. So what you are saying is not so much about providing incentives but removing artificial incentives. RF. Both have to happen. We have to switch. We have to move past this tipping point. CS. I have always said that if you take away the subsidies that are poured into oil and coal and so forth, and you force the consumers and producers of fossil fuel-based energy to pay the true and complete costs of these things, you will have renewable energy this afternoon. Those businesses will be gone in a heartbeat. Do you agree? RF. Absolutely. Then there is also a role for regulations. We have got ridiculously high cancer rates, and I think that if we finally get to the bottom of why we have such rising cancer rates, it is because of lack of regulation of such huge amounts of toxins that we have in the air and the water because companies are not regulated, chemicals are not regulated, toxins of all kinds are not regulated. And they need to be. We need to have a society that says no. You cannot put poisons in the products that you make for people to use. CS. Right. Now how do you get people to care about all of this? I mean, obviously people care about cancer, but in a world where there are pressing worries, where people are losing their jobs, and turn on the television and they see houses on fire, cats stuck up trees, etc. With all the distractions in people's lives, why should people care about something that is essentially long-term in its nature? RF. Well, there are two answers to that. One is that a lot of what is happening is not long-term. It is happening right now. That is something that you can look at with our conversation about the rise in cancer rates. People need to make the connection between the products they are using in their everyday lives and the effect on their health. If you can look at every single product that people use and say, gee, it is not that hard to understand that we are really having a negative impact on the health of society and of course all the species that we share the earth with by using these toxic products. The other piece is the role of government. Government is there to look out for the best interest of the people in general. And so it is really not up to people to be able to solve the climate change problem, but it is up to governments to take a higher perspective of all of this and understand that they need to create a platform and set the rules by which society operates, so that society can continue to operate. I understand that the average person does not connect the dots necessarily with climate change, or if they do, they feel like it is totally out of their control. I think it is an absolute travesty that the government does not require cars that get the highest mileage possible. For example, people should not have a choice when they go to a car dealer to get a gas guzzler. It simply shouldn't be an option. CS, well, here you are talking about a couple of things. First of all, you are talking about an enormous amount of power concentrated in the federal government. And I am not sure that most Americans are going to want that level of intrusion. RF, set some rules, that is all. I am just saying, we need the power to set some rules. The Obama administration finally raised the car efficiency standards, the CAFE standards, to 35 miles per gallon by 2015, an increase that we could not get done since the 1970s. So all that had to be done was many years ago they needed to keep increasing those standards. And they did not, because of industry lobbying. CS, I have come to know you as a very sincerely dedicated and committed person with respect to these issues, and I am sure several others. You must have had, in the 14 years you have been doing this, some very rewarding experiences in terms of influencing people to do good things. You have over 100,000 unique visitors a month. That is a lot of traffic. Tell me about some of the most rewarding experiences that you have had. RF, well, seeing the field grow from just a pimple to something where you hear world leaders talking about the subject, they all understand what we are dealing with. To see renewable energy grow from nothing to being the industry of the future. To see green building grow from nothing to being completely mainstream and at the point where just about every single town and city is incorporating green building standards. To see smart growth take off. I mean, basically every single concept that all of us have been working towards is coming to fruition. It has taken a really long time, and we have had 8 really terrible years under the Bush administration which took us backward instead of forward. It is absolutely happening and going to happen. I just pray that it happens in time. CS, yes. It's funny you mention that very last phrase there, because that is what I was going to conclude with. Are you essentially optimistic or pessimistic about the way this is going to turn out? RF, I am really on the fence. I am optimistic that everything that we all want to happen will happen. I am not optimistic that it will happen fast enough. I would have to say that I think that there is no getting around some climate change at this point. We are seeing it. I am seeing it out my window right this second, but I do think that we are going to have a very difficult period of time. I think we are going to be having a lot of very severe weather events that are going to be catastrophic. I think that we will get through them and that at some point things will shift extremely rapidly. I think that there will be entirely new industries that do not exist today, for example that remove the carbon from the atmosphere. I think it will all happen. I even think that at some point the world will understand that it cannot just allow people to produce endless children and that we will actually have to control our population. But will the transition to any of this be easy? I do not think so. CS, okay. Anything else you'd like readers to know? RF, here's my take on the Obama administration versus the previous administration. I think that this just does not get talked about or is understood enough out there. It is like night and day. People, when they look at the Obama administration, tend to only look at what is going on superficially in terms of what the media is talking about, that is, the major legislation that he is not being successful right now in putting forward. But what I look at is number one, his attitude, which is 100% opposed to the Bush administration attitude. They saw anything to do with the environment as a cause to be avoided. Obama really understands the importance of keeping our environment safe and healthy. He has made some excellent appointees to every single agency that deals with the environment, including the USDA, Department of the Interior, as well as the Department of Energy and the other agencies that are involved. If you look at what each of those agencies are doing, there is really a sea change in their approach from the Bush administration. I was so impressed listening to Secretary Salazar, Secretary of the Interior, and this is something that none of us would really hear about, but he is really looking at conservation on a landscape scale, were the words that he used. This is hugely important because more and more we have a very fragmented conservation network, where our lands are protected. Animal species and plant species are having a very difficult time coping with climate change, coping with endless development on the part of human beings and invasive species that are now coming in and taking over, and killing millions and millions of acres of trees. Taking a landscape approach is very important to bridging the gaps and bringing these fragmented communities together. So my take on the Obama approach is that it is absolutely essential. He is doing a fantastic job as best he can with hands half tied. There is no comparison. He has been undoing all the terrible things that the Bush administration did for 8 years of unraveling and not enforcing any of our environmental laws, and of course continuing to subsidize the fossil fuel industry at the expense of the renewable energy industry, among many other things. CS, good stuff, Rona. Thank you so much.